He had finally saved enough money for a down payment on a small house in Maple Ridge neighborhood. The house wasn't fancy, but it was his. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and most importantly, a driveway that led to his own garage. Moving day was exciting. David's friends helped him carry boxes and furniture into his new home. The neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving from their yards and offering bottled water to the moving crew. Everything felt perfect until the 3rd day after moving in. David was unpacking boxes in his living room when he heard a car door slam outside. He looked through his front window and couldn't believe what he saw. A shiny silver car was parked right in his driveway, not just partially blocking it, but completely taking up the space where he usually parked his own car. At first, David thought maybe it was a mistake. Perhaps someone was lost or having car trouble. He waited for about an hour, thinking the person would come back and move their car. But nobody came. The silver car just sat there like it belonged in his driveway. David decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to see if he could find the owner. He knocked on a few doors asking if anyone knew whose car it was. Mrs. Peterson from next door told him it probably belonged to Helen, who lived in the big house at the end of the street. She was on the homeowner association board and sometimes had guests over. Armed with this information, David walked down to Helen's house. It was much larger than his, with perfectly manicured landscaping and a circular driveway that could easily fit 4 cars. He rang the doorbell and waited. A woman in her early 50s answered the door. She had short blonde hair and was wearing expensive-looking clothes. Her smile seemed fake, the kind people use when they're pretending to be nice. "Hi, I'm David. I just moved into the house 3 doors down," he said politely. "I think one of your guests might have parked in my driveway by mistake." Helen looked at him like he had said something amusing. "Oh, you must be the new owner. I'm Helen and I'm on the HOA board here. That's my car in your driveway." David was confused. "Your car? But why is it in my driveway?" Helen's fake smile got bigger. "Well, the previous owner, Mr. Johnson, always let me use his driveway when I had company over. It's been that way for years. I assumed you'd continue the arrangement. But nobody asked me about any arrangement," David said, trying to stay calm. "I need to use my own driveway to park my car." Helen waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about it. I only use it occasionally when I'm entertaining. You're new here, so you probably don't understand how things work in our community yet. We all help each other out." David felt his face getting warm. "I appreciate that neighbors help each other, but I really need access to my own driveway. Could you please move your car?" "I suppose I could move it later tonight," Helen said, checking her expensive watch. "My guests won't be leaving for a few hours. You can just park on the street for now." Before David could respond, Helen closed the door. He stood there for a moment, not sure what had just happened. Had she really just told him to park on the street so she could use his driveway? David walked back to his house, feeling frustrated and confused. He had never dealt with anything like this before. When he was renting apartments, parking was assigned and clear. This was supposed to be his house, his property, his driveway. He called his older brother, Tom, who had owned a house for 10 years. "She said what?" Tom asked after David explained the situation. "Dude, that's your property. She can't just use your driveway because she feels like it." "But she's on the HOA board," David said. "Maybe she does have some kind of right to use it?" Tom laughed. "Being on the HOA board doesn't give you the right to use other people's driveways. That woman is taking advantage of you because you're new. You need to stand up for yourself." That evening, David noticed several cars parked on Helen's street and in her circular driveway. Her dinner party was clearly in full swing, but her silver car was still sitting in his driveway. David had to park his car on the street, something that annoyed him more with each passing hour. Around 11 at night, David heard car doors slamming and engines starting. Helen's guests were finally leaving. He waited another hour, thinking Helen would come move her car, but she didn't. The silver car sat in his driveway all night. The next morning, David was getting ready for work when he looked outside. The silver car was still there. He was going to be late for work if he didn't leave soon, but his car was blocked in by Helen's vehicle on the street. David marched down to Helen's house and rang the doorbell. It took several rings before Helen answered, wearing a silk robe and looking annoyed. "It's very early," she said, not quite hiding her irritation. "Your car is still in my driveway," David said. "I need to get to work." Helen sighed dramatically. "Fine, I'll move it in a few minutes. But honestly, you're being very inflexible for someone who's new to the neighborhood. Mr. Johnson never complained about these things." "I'm not Mr. Johnson," David said firmly. "I'm asking you nicely to please not park in my driveway anymore." Helen's expression changed. The fake friendliness disappeared completely. "Listen, I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years. I'm on the HOA board, and I know how things work around here. You might want to think carefully about making enemies with the wrong people." David felt a chill run down his spine. Was she threatening him? Over a parking space in his own driveway? "I'm not trying to make enemies," David said. "I just want to be able to use my own property." Helen stared at him for a long moment. "I'll move my car. But you should know that new residents usually go through a probationary period with the HOA. We like to make sure people fit in with our community standards." She closed the door again, leaving David standing on her porch wondering what he had gotten himself into. 20 minutes later, Helen moved her car, but David was already late for work. That afternoon, David found a notice from the HOA in his mailbox. He had been cited for leaving his trash cans out past the pickup time. The fine was $50. David looked at the timestamp on the notice. It had been issued the same morning he had asked Helen to move her car. David realized this wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. Helen wasn't just some neighbor who had made an innocent mistake. She was someone who was used to getting her way and didn't like being told no, and now she was using her position on the HOA board to make his life difficult. As David sat in his new house that evening, looking at the HOA citation, he wondered if he had made a mistake buying in this neighborhood. But then he looked around at his first home, the place he had worked so hard to afford, and decided he wasn't going to let anyone push him around. He had no idea that this was just the beginning of a battle that would test his patience, his resolve, and his faith in doing the right thing. Helen had clearly decided that the new guy needed to learn his place. But David was about to learn something too. Sometimes standing up for yourself requires more than just being polite. The next few weeks turned David's life upside down. What started as a simple parking dispute had become an all-out war, and Helen was clearly the one holding most of the weapons. Every Friday evening, like clockwork, Helen's silver car would appear in David's driveway. She had turned this into her regular routine, hosting dinner parties and using his driveway as overflow parking for her guests. David would come home from work to find his access blocked, forcing him to park blocks away on the street. The first few times, David tried the polite approach. He would walk down to Helen's house and knock on the door, asking her to move her car. But Helen had perfected the art of making him wait. She would take forever to answer the door, then act surprised that he was upset about the parking situation. "Oh my goodness. Is that car in your way again?" she would say with fake concern. "I had no idea it would be such a problem. I'll try to remember to tell my guests not to park there." But the car was never a guest's car. It was always Helen's silver sedan, and she knew exactly where she had parked it. The games she played were obvious but somehow hard to prove. She would promise to move the car in just a few minutes, but those few minutes would stretch into hours. One particular Friday evening, David came home after a long day at work to find not just Helen's car, but two other vehicles in his driveway. A red SUV and a blue convertible were parked behind Helen's sedan, completely blocking his access to his own garage. David felt his blood pressure rising as he parked 3 blocks away and walked back to his house. This wasn't just inconsiderate anymore. This was deliberate harassment. He knocked on Helen's door, but this time he could hear the dinner party in full swing. Laughter, music, and conversation flowed from inside the house. When Helen finally answered the door, she was holding a glass of wine and had clearly been enjoying her evening. "Oh, David," she said, drawing out his name like it was an inconvenience. "What brings you by?" "There are 3 cars in my driveway," David said, struggling to keep his voice calm. "I can't get to my garage." Helen peered around him as if she was just noticing the cars for the first time. "Oh dear, my guests must have gotten confused about where to park. You know how it is with dinner parties. People just park wherever they can find a spot." "But it's my driveway," David said. "They can't just park wherever they want." "Well, technically you're right," Helen said, taking a sip of her wine. "But we're right in the middle of dinner. I can't really ask my guests to interrupt their meal to move cars around. Could you possibly just park somewhere else tonight? I promise they'll be gone by morning." David looked at her in disbelief. By morning, you want me to park on the street all night because your guest took over my driveway? Helen's fake smile faltered slightly. David, you're being very unreasonable. These are important people in our community. The HOA president is here tonight, along with several other board members. I really don't think this is the time to make a scene. I'm not making a scene, David said. I'm asking people to stop parking in my driveway. And I'm trying to help you understand how things work in this neighborhood, Helen replied, her voice getting sharper. Sometimes we all have to make small sacrifices for the good of the community. David realized he wasn't going to win this argument tonight. Helen's guests probably had no idea they were parked illegally, and causing a scene at her dinner party would only make him look like the bad guy. He walked away, parked on the street, and spent the evening researching his rights as a homeowner. The next morning, all 3 cars were gone, but David found another HOA citation in his mailbox. This time, he was being fined for having weeds in his flower bed. David looked at his flower bed, which he had just cleaned up the weekend before. There were maybe 2 small dandelions that he hadn't noticed. This became the pattern. Every time David complained about the parking situation, he would find a new HOA citation within days. His grass was half an inch too tall. His mailbox needed cleaning. His house numbers weren't the right color. Each citation came with a $50 fine and a passive-aggressive note about maintaining community standards. David tried calling the HOA office to complain about Helen's behavior, but the woman who answered the phone told him that parking disputes between neighbors should be worked out privately. When David explained that Helen was on the HOA board and was retaliating against him with frivolous citations, the woman suggested he attend the next board meeting to voice his concerns. The board meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. David arrived early and sat in the back row, watching as other homeowners filed in with their own complaints and questions. Helen sat at a long table at the front of the room with 4 other board members. When it came time for resident comments, David stood up and introduced himself. I'm having an ongoing problem with one of the board members using my driveway as personal parking, he said, being careful not to mention Helen by name. Helen immediately spoke up. Mr. Peterson, I think you're referring to our earlier conversation about community cooperation. As I explained to you, longtime residents sometimes have informal arrangements that help everyone get along. But I never agreed to any arrangement, David said. And when I ask for my driveway to be clear, I get cited for HOA violations. Another board member, an older man with gray hair, looked confused. Are you saying someone is parking in your driveway without permission? Before David could answer, Helen jumped in again. What we have here is a new resident who doesn't quite understand how our neighborhood works yet. Mr. Peterson seems to think that every single rule should be enforced to the letter, rather than understanding that we're all neighbors trying to get along. I just want to be able to park in my own driveway, David said, feeling frustrated that Helen was twisting his words. Helen smiled that fake smile again. And I'm sure we can work something out that makes everyone happy. Perhaps Mr. Peterson could reserve one side of his driveway for his own use and allow the community to use the other side when needed. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. It's not a community driveway. It's my driveway. It's part of my property. The gray-haired board member looked at Helen. Helen, you're not actually parking in this gentleman's driveway, are you? Helen laughed lightly. Of course not. I think there might be some confusion about property lines. I've been parking in the same spot for years without any problems. David realized that Helen was outright lying to the other board members. She was making it sound like there was some kind of misunderstanding about where her car was parked, rather than admitting that she was deliberately using his driveway. After the meeting, David approached the gray-haired board member whose name was Robert. She's parking in my driveway, David said quietly. She's been doing it every Friday for weeks. Robert looked uncomfortable. Helen has been on this board for a long time, and she's always been very dedicated to the community. Are you sure there isn't some kind of misunderstanding? David pulled out his phone and showed Robert photos he had taken of Helen's car in his driveway. Robert's expression changed as he looked at the pictures. This does look like it's clearly in your driveway, Robert said. I'll talk to Helen about this. But David's hopes were crushed the very next Friday when Helen's car appeared in his driveway again, this time with a note under his windshield wiper. The note said, "Some people need to learn that making waves in a small community can have consequences. Hope you're enjoying your new neighborhood." David stared at the note, realizing that Helen had no intention of stopping her behavior. In fact, she was escalating it. She wasn't just taking his parking space anymore. She was making it clear that she could make his life miserable in other ways too. That weekend, David received not one but 3 HOA citations. His outdoor light was too bright. His garden hose was visible from the street. His car had been parked facing the wrong direction. David sat in his living room that Sunday evening, looking at the stack of citations and fines that now totaled over $400. He had tried being polite. He had tried going through official channels. He had tried reasoning with Helen and explaining his position to other board members. Nothing had worked. Helen had made it clear that she could do whatever she wanted, and if he didn't like it, she would use her position on the HOA board to make his life miserable. She was betting that he would eventually give up and either accept her behavior or move away. But David wasn't ready to give up. In fact, Helen's bullying tactics were starting to make him angry. He had worked hard to buy this house, and he wasn't going to let some entitled neighbor drive him out of his own home. David decided it was time to stop playing defense and start learning what his real options were. If Helen wanted to play hardball, he was going to make sure he knew all the rules of the game. He spent that evening researching property law, tenant rights, and HOA regulations. What he discovered would change everything. David spent the entire weekend buried in legal websites, city ordinances, and property law documents. What he discovered made him realize that he had been approaching this problem all wrong. He had been trying to reason with Helen and work through the HOA system, but he had real legal rights that didn't depend on anyone's cooperation. The most important thing he learned was that in his state, property owners had the absolute right to control who parked on their private property. It didn't matter if someone had an arrangement with the previous owner. It didn't matter if they were on the HOA board. It didn't even matter if they claimed they had permission. The property belonged to David, and he could decide who was allowed to use it. Even better, David discovered that vehicles parked on private property without permission could be towed at the owner's expense. The law was very clear about this. Property owners didn't need to give multiple warnings or go through any kind of formal process. They could simply call a towing company and have unauthorized vehicles removed. David also learned about something called adverse possession, which was what Helen was trying to do by using his driveway regularly. In some states, if someone used another person's property openly and regularly for a certain number of years, they could actually gain legal rights to that property. David realized that by allowing Helen to continue parking in his driveway, he might be setting himself up for bigger legal problems down the road. Armed with this new knowledge, David called his friend Jake, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown. Jake confirmed everything David had read and gave him some additional advice. "The key is documentation," Jake explained. "You need to create a clear paper trail showing that you've told her not to park there and that she's continuing to do it anyway. Take photos with timestamps, save any notes or messages, and make sure you have evidence of every time this happens." Jake also recommended that David send Helen a formal written notice, delivered by certified mail, clearly stating that she was not allowed to park in his driveway and that any future violations would result in towing. This would remove any possible argument that Helen didn't understand the situation or thought she had permission. David spent Sunday afternoon crafting the letter. He kept it simple and professional, avoiding any emotional language or personal attacks. The letter simply stated that Helen was not authorized to park in his driveway, that her continued parking there constituted trespassing, and that any vehicles found on his property without permission would be towed at the owner's expense. Monday morning, David went to the post office and sent the letter by certified mail, which would require Helen's signature upon delivery. He also made copies of everything for his own records. While he was out, he stopped by several towing companies to understand their procedures and pricing. Most towing companies told David the same thing. If a vehicle was parked on his private property without permission, and he had clearly posted no parking signs, they could tow the vehicle immediately upon his request. The cost would be charged to the vehicle owner, not to David. David chose a company called Quick Response Towing, which operated 24 hours a day and promised to respond within 30 minutes. The owner, a friendly man named Carlos, explained that they dealt with private property towing situations regularly. "The important thing is that you have clear signage posted," Carlos explained. "The signs need to be visible and need to state that unauthorized vehicles will be towed. That way, nobody can claim they didn't know they weren't supposed to park there. David bought professional "no parking, violators will be towed" signs from a local hardware store. The signs were bright yellow with bold black lettering, impossible to miss. He installed them at the entrance to his driveway, making sure they were clearly visible from the street. He also bought a security camera system and installed cameras that covered his driveway and the street in front of his house. The cameras would automatically record any vehicles that entered his driveway, creating a time-stamped record of violations. Wednesday afternoon, David received a receipt confirming that Helen had signed for his certified letter. He had expected some kind of response from her, but Helen remained silent. No phone call, no visit, no acknowledgement that she had received his formal notice. Friday evening arrived, and David waited to see what would happen. He had his phone ready with the towing company's number programmed in. He had copies of his certified letter, photos of his posted signs, and his legal research all organized in a folder. At 6:30, just like clockwork, Helen's silver sedan pulled into David's driveway. She parked in exactly the same spot she had been using for weeks, directly in front of David's garage. David watched from his living room window as Helen got out of her car, glanced at the new "no parking" signs, and walked back toward her own house without any apparent concern. David felt his heart racing as he picked up his phone and called Quick Response Towing. "This is David Peterson. I need a vehicle towed from my private property. The address is 247 Maple Ridge Drive. We'll have a truck there within 30 minutes, the dispatcher said. Make sure you're available to sign the authorization form." David paced around his house, checking his watch every few minutes. He kept looking out the window at Helen's car, half expecting her to come back and move it before the tow truck arrived. But the silver sedan just sat there, blocking his garage as if nothing had changed. 25 minutes later, David heard the rumble of a diesel engine outside. A large flatbed tow truck with Quick Response Towing, painted on the side, pulled up in front of his house. Carlos, the owner David had spoken with earlier, jumped out of the truck. "You're Mr. Peterson?" Carlos asked, walking up to David's front door. "That's me," David said, feeling nervous but determined. Carlos looked at the silver sedan parked in David's driveway, then at the clearly posted "no parking" signs. "Yep, this is pretty straightforward," he said. "I'll need you to sign this form authorizing the tow, and then we'll get this car out of here." David signed the authorization form with slightly shaky hands. He was really doing this. After weeks of being pushed around and treated like he didn't matter, he was finally standing up for himself. Carlos worked quickly and efficiently. He positioned his flatbed truck, lowered the bed, and used a winch to pull Helen's sedan up onto the truck. The whole process took less than 15 minutes. Other neighbors had started coming out of their houses to see what was happening. "Where are you taking the car?" David asked. "Our impound lot on Industrial Boulevard," Carlos replied. "The owner will need to pay the towing fee plus daily storage charges to get it back. They'll also need to show proof of ownership and a valid driver's license." As the tow truck pulled away with Helen's car on the back, David noticed several neighbors watching from their yards. Some looked curious, others looked concerned. David wondered what Helen had told them about their dispute. David didn't have to wait long to find out. Less than an hour after the tow truck left, David heard aggressive knocking on his front door. When he looked through the peephole, he saw Helen standing on his porch with her face red with anger. David opened the door but kept the chain lock engaged. "Hi, Helen, what can I do for you?" "Where's my car?" Helen demanded. "What did you do with my car?" "Your car was parked illegally on my private property," David said calmly. "I had it towed just like the signs clearly state would happen. You can't just tow someone's car." Helen shouted. "That's theft." "I'm calling the police." "You should call the police," David agreed. "They'll explain to you that property owners have the right to tow unauthorized vehicles from their private property. I sent you a certified letter explaining this earlier this week." Helen's face got even redder. "This is harassment." "This is retaliation." "I'm going to have you arrested." "I'm not harassing anyone," David said. "I'm simply enforcing my property rights. The same thing will happen to any vehicle that parks in my driveway without permission." Helen started to say something else, but David closed the door. He could hear her yelling on his porch for a few more minutes before she finally stomped away. David sat down in his living room and took a deep breath. He had done it. He had actually followed through on his threat to have Helen's car towed. It felt scary and empowering at the same time. About an hour later, David heard sirens outside. 2 police cars pulled up in front of his house. David's stomach dropped as he realized Helen had made good on her threat to call the police. 2 officers knocked on David's door. David answered politely and invited them inside. "Officers, I think I know why you're here. My neighbor called about her car being towed from my driveway." The older officer, whose name tag said Rodriguez, nodded. "That's right. She's claiming you stole her car." David showed the officers his property deed proving he owned the driveway. He showed them the certified letter he had sent to Helen. He showed them the clearly posted no parking signs. He showed them the authorization form he had signed for the towing company. Officer Rodriguez examined all the documents carefully. "Sir, you have every right to tow vehicles from your private property. This isn't theft, it's property enforcement. The lady down the street isn't going to like hearing this, but you haven't broken any laws." The younger officer asked, "Has this been an ongoing problem?" David told them about weeks of Helen parking in his driveway, the HOA retaliation, and his attempts to resolve the situation peacefully. The officers took notes and seemed sympathetic to David's situation. "Our advice is to keep documenting everything," Officer Rodriguez said. "Keep taking photos, keep copies of all your notices and correspondence. If this escalates into harassment, we'll need that evidence." After the police left, David felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had won this round, but he suspected Helen wasn't going to give up easily. She had shown that she was willing to abuse her HOA position to retaliate against him. Now that he had escalated things by having her car towed, David wondered what she might do next. As if in answer to his thoughts, David's phone rang. It was his work number calling his personal phone, which was unusual. When he answered, his supervisor was on the line. "David, I just got a very strange call about you," his supervisor said. "Someone claiming to be from your homeowner association called to say that you've been causing problems in your neighborhood and that it might affect your security clearance at work." David felt his blood run cold. Helen was now trying to attack his career. David's hands were shaking as he explained the situation to his supervisor. The idea that Helen would call his workplace to try to damage his career was beyond anything he had imagined. This wasn't just about parking anymore. Helen was trying to destroy his life. "I want you to know that we don't take these kinds of calls seriously," his supervisor assured him. "But you should probably document this incident in case it becomes a pattern. And David, you might want to consider talking to a lawyer if this neighbor is escalating things this far." After hanging up, David realized he was in deeper than he had thought. Helen wasn't just some difficult neighbor. She was someone who would use any weapon at her disposal to get revenge when she didn't get her way. The fact that she had tried to interfere with his job showed that she was willing to cross lines that most people wouldn't even consider. David spent a sleepless night wondering what Helen might do next. Would she try to damage his credit? Would she spread lies about him to other neighbors? Would she try to get him fired from his job? The possibilities seemed endless and terrifying. The next morning, David found a notice taped to his front door. It was an official-looking document from the HOA threatening immediate legal action if he didn't remove his unauthorized signage within 48 hours. The notice claimed that his no parking signs violated the community's aesthetic standards and created a hostile environment for neighbors. David called the HOA office and asked to speak to someone about the notice. The woman who answered the phone was the same one he had spoken to before, but her tone was much colder this time. "Mr. Peterson, the board has reviewed your case and determined that your signage is not in compliance with community standards," she said in a robotic voice. "You need to remove the signs immediately or face fines of $100 per day." "But how am I supposed to enforce my property rights without posting signs?" David asked. "That's not the HOA's concern," the woman replied. "Our job is to maintain community standards, not to mediate neighbor disputes." David realized that Helen had somehow convinced the other board members to support her position. Either she had lied to them about what was really happening, or they were all working together to force him out of the neighborhood. That afternoon, David decided to visit Robert, the gray-haired board member who had seemed sympathetic at the meeting. Robert lived in a nice house about 6 blocks away from David's place. When Robert answered the door, he looked uncomfortable seeing David. "Oh, hello, Mr. Peterson. What brings you by?" I wanted to talk to you about the notice I received today, David said. I'm being told to remove signs that protect my property rights. Robert glanced around nervously as if he was worried someone might see them talking. Listen, David, can I call you David? You seem like a nice young man, but you're fighting a battle you can't win. Helen has a lot of influence in this community, but she's breaking the law by parking in my driveway, David said, and now she's retaliating against me through the HOA. Robert sighed heavily. Look, I've been on this board for 8 years. Helen has been here for 15. She knows where all the bodies are buried, if you know what I mean. She has dirt on half the people in this neighborhood, including some of the other board members. So you're saying I should just let her walk all over me? I'm saying you should consider whether this fight is worth it, Robert said quietly. Helen doesn't forget, and she doesn't forgive. If you keep pushing this, she'll make your life miserable in ways you can't even imagine. David left Robert's house feeling more alone than ever. Even the board members who knew Helen was wrong were too afraid to stand up to her. She had built a system where she could do whatever she wanted, and anyone who challenged her would face systematic harassment until they gave up. But David wasn't ready to give up. In fact, Robert's warning had the opposite effect of what was intended. David realized that if he backed down now, Helen would know she could get away with anything. She would continue to abuse her power and bully other residents who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. David decided to escalate his own tactics. If Helen wanted to play hardball, he would show her that two could play that game. First, David started documenting everything Helen did. He set up his security cameras to record not just his own property, but also the street in front of Helen's house. He wanted evidence of any HOA violations that Helen herself might be committing. It didn't take long to find some. Helen's landscaping crew left grass clippings on the sidewalk after mowing, which violated city ordinances. Her garbage cans stayed out past the pickup time on several occasions. She had a small decorative flag in her front yard that wasn't on the approved list of HOA decorations. David filed formal complaints about each violation, using the same language and procedures that Helen had been using against him. He made sure to include photographs and timestamps with each complaint. Second, David researched Helen's background and discovered some interesting information. Helen had been involved in several legal disputes with previous neighbors over the years. One family had actually moved away after a prolonged conflict with Helen over tree trimming. Another neighbor had filed a harassment complaint against Helen that was eventually dropped. David also discovered that Helen's own house had been cited by the city for several code violations in the past, including an unpermitted deck addition and improper drainage that had flooded a neighbor's yard. Armed with this information, David decided to attend the next HOA board meeting and turn the tables on Helen. But before the meeting could happen, Helen made her next move. 3 weeks after the first towing incident on another Friday evening, Helen's silver sedan appeared in David's driveway again. David couldn't believe it. After being towed once after receiving police confirmation that the towing was legal, after having her attempt to interfere with his job backfire, Helen was still so arrogant that she thought she could continue parking in his driveway. This time, David didn't hesitate. He called Quick Response Towing immediately. This is David Peterson again. Same situation as before. I need the silver sedan towed from my driveway. Same car as last time? Carlos asked. Man, some people never learn. We'll be right there. While David waited for the tow truck, he called the police non-emergency line to report the incident. He wanted official documentation that this was a repeat offense in case Helen tried to escalate things again. The tow truck arrived even faster this time, and Carlos seemed almost amused by the situation. I've never had to tow the same car from the same location twice, he said, as he loaded Helen's sedan onto his truck. The fees are going to be higher this time because it's a repeat offense. How much higher? David asked. First towing was $350, Carlos said. Repeat offense within 90 days is $525, plus daily storage fees. This lady is going to pay over $600 to get her car back. As the tow truck pulled away with Helen's car for the second time, David noticed that even more neighbors had come out to watch. Some of them looked at David with expressions he couldn't quite read. Were they impressed that he had stood up to Helen? Were they worried about what Helen might do in retaliation? Or were they angry at David for causing drama in their quiet neighborhood? David didn't have to wait long to find out. Within an hour of the second towing, David heard a commotion outside. He looked through his window to see Helen marching down the street with 3 other people David recognized as HOA board members. The group gathered on the sidewalk in front of David's house, and Helen was clearly agitated, gesturing wildly and pointing at his house. David could hear raised voices but couldn't make out the specific words. Then the group marched up to David's front door and knocked loudly. When David answered, Helen was flanked by the other board members like some kind of HOA enforcement squad. David Peterson, Helen said in a formal tone, "We are here in our official capacity as members of the Maple Ridge Homeowner Association Board. We are issuing you a formal warning about your disruptive behavior and your violation of community standards." One of the other board members, a thin man David had never spoken to before, held up an official-looking document. "You are hereby notified that your aggressive actions toward fellow residents constitute harassment under our community guidelines. You are also in violation of multiple HOA regulations regarding signage, property maintenance, and neighborly conduct." David looked at the document they were trying to hand him. It was filled with legal-sounding language and listed dozens of alleged violations, most of which seemed completely made up. "I'm not accepting that document," David said calmly. "And I'm not discussing anything without my own legal representation present." Helen's face turned red. "You can't just refuse to accept official HOA business." "I can and I am," David replied. "If you want to communicate with me officially, you can do it through certified mail like I did with you. And if you want to trespass on my property again with unauthorized vehicles, you already know what will happen." Helen looked like she was about to explode. "This isn't over!" she shouted as David closed his door. "We'll see how tough you are when we start foreclosure proceedings on your house." David's blood ran cold. Could they actually foreclose on his house over HOA violations? He realized he was going to need real legal help, not just internet research and advice from friends. The next morning, David called the lawyer his friend Jake had recommended. It was time to stop playing defense and start fighting back with professional help. But first, David had to deal with the immediate crisis. Helen's threat about foreclosure had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He spent the weekend researching HOA foreclosure laws and discovered that in some cases, homeowner associations could actually force the sale of homes over unpaid fines and fees. David realized that this fight was no longer just about parking. Helen was trying to take his house away from him. The stakes had just gotten very, very high. David's meeting with attorney Jennifer Walsh changed everything. Walsh specialized in HOA disputes and had seen cases like David's before. After reviewing all of David's documentation, she smiled grimly. "You've actually done everything right," Walsh told him. "You've documented everything, followed proper procedures, and most importantly, you have clear evidence that this board member is abusing her position for personal retaliation." Walsh explained that Helen's threat about foreclosure was mostly bluff. While HOAs could foreclose over unpaid fines in extreme cases, David's situation didn't meet the legal requirements. Most of Helen's citations were frivolous and wouldn't hold up under legal scrutiny. "But here's the really interesting part," Walsh continued. "Your neighbor has committed several criminal acts. Filing false police reports, interfering with your employment, and using her HOA position for personal revenge are all actionable offenses. We can fight back." Walsh drafted a comprehensive legal response that turned the tables completely. First, she filed a formal complaint with the STA. David never thought buying his first house would turn into a nightmare. After working as a computer programmer for 8 years, the Attorney General's office about HOA board misconduct. Second, she sent a cease and desist letter to Helen personally, threatening criminal charges if the harassment continued. Third, she demanded a special meeting of the HOA board to address the violations of fiduciary duty. The cease and desist letter was particularly effective. It detailed every incident of Helen's behavior, including her illegal parking, her retaliation through frivolous citations, her attempt to interfere with David's employment, and her abuse of the HOA process. The letter warned that any further harassment would result in immediate criminal charges and a civil lawsuit for damages. David felt better than he had in months after meeting with Walsh. For the first time since this whole mess started, he felt like he had real power instead of just being a victim. But Helen wasn't finished. 2 days after receiving the cease and desist letter, she made her biggest mistake yet. David was working from home when he heard a commotion outside. He looked through his window to see Helen in his driveway with two men he didn't recognize. They appeared to be measuring his driveway and taking photographs. David grabbed his phone and started recording as he walked outside. "Excuse me, what are you doing on my property?" Helen looked up with that fake smile of hers. "Oh, hello, David. These are city inspectors. We've had some concerns about whether your driveway meets current zoning requirements." One of the men looked confused. "Ma'am, we're not city inspectors. We're from Metro Property Services. You hired us to survey this driveway for a potential easement claim." David kept recording as the truth came out. Helen had hired a private company to survey his property, apparently trying to find some way to claim legal access to his driveway. The surveyor explained that Helen had told them she had mineral rights or some other legal claim to the property. "I'm going to have to ask all of you to leave my property immediately," David said. Still recording. "You're trespassing and I'm calling the police." Helen's fake composure finally cracked completely. "You think you're so smart with your lawyers and your cameras? This is my neighborhood. I've been here for 15 years. You're nothing but a troublemaker who doesn't belong here." The surveyor and his partner quickly packed up their equipment and left, clearly wanting no part of whatever was happening between David and Helen. Helen continued her rant, screaming about property values and community standards, and how David was ruining everything. David sent the video to his lawyer immediately. Walsh called him back within an hour, practically laughing with delight. "She just handed us a criminal trespassing case on a silver platter, and hiring surveyors under false pretenses could constitute fraud. Your neighbor just made a very expensive mistake." That evening, David received an unexpected visitor. Robert, the gray-haired board member, knocked on his door looking nervous and apologetic. "David, I owe you an apology," Robert said. "What happened today with the surveyors was the last straw. Helen told the board she was having your property surveyed for drainage issues, but we found out she was actually trying to fabricate some kind of easement claim." Robert explained that several board members had finally had enough of Helen's behavior. Her lies about the surveying incident had made them realize that she had probably been lying about David all along. "We've called for an emergency board meeting tomorrow night," Robert said. "Helen is going to be removed from the board. I wanted to give you a heads up in case she tries to retaliate again before then." The emergency board meeting was unlike anything David had expected. When he arrived at the community center, there were dozens of residents in attendance. Word had spread about the conflict between David and Helen, and apparently many neighbors had their own stories about Helen's bullying behavior. One by one, residents stood up to share their experiences. Mrs. Chen described how Helen had filed complaints about her vegetable garden until she gave up and removed it. The Johnsons talked about being cited for having the wrong color mailbox after they refused to vote for Helen's friend in the last board election. An elderly man named Frank explained how Helen had tried to force him to remove a memorial garden for his late wife because it didn't meet community standards. David realized that Helen had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for years, but people had been too afraid or isolated to speak up. His fight had finally given others the courage to come forward. When Helen tried to defend herself, her explanations only made things worse. She claimed that all the citations were justified and that residents needed to follow the rules. She insisted that David was a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. But when Robert presented the evidence about the fraudulent surveying incident, Helen had no answer. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position, effective immediately. They also voted to dismiss all pending citations against David and to investigate all the citations Helen had issued over the past 2 years. The victory felt surreal to Chevy. After months of feeling powerless and isolated, he had not only won his own fight but had helped free the entire neighborhood from Helen's tyranny. But the story wasn't quite over. 3 days after being removed from the board, Helen made one final attempt at revenge. David came home from work to find Helen's silver sedan parked in his driveway again. But this time she had gone further. She had also parked a second car, an old pickup truck, behind her sedan. Both vehicles completely blocked David's access to his garage. David almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Even after being removed from the HOA board, even after receiving a cease and desist letter, even after being caught trespassing with fraudulent surveyors, Helen still thought she could park in his driveway. David called Quick Response Towing and requested 2 trucks. "Same address as before, but this time I need both vehicles towed. It's the same repeat offender, plus she brought a friend." Carlos and another driver arrived within 20 minutes. The fees for towing both vehicles, including repeat offender penalties, came to over $1,200. As the two tow trucks pulled away with both of Helen's vehicles, David noticed that practically the entire neighborhood had come out to watch. But this time, instead of looking concerned or confused, people were smiling. Some even clapped as the trucks drove away. Mrs. Chen brought David a plate of homemade cookies. The Johnsons invited him to their barbecue the following weekend. Frank thanked him for having the courage to stand up to Helen when nobody else would. David learned later that Helen had to pay nearly $1,500 in towing and storage fees to get both vehicles back. She also received a criminal citation for trespassing, thanks to the video David had taken of the surveying incident. The new HOA board, with Robert as the interim president, implemented new policies to prevent board members from abusing their positions. They established an appeals process for citations and required unanimous board approval for any fines over $25. Helen never parked in David's driveway again. In fact, she avoided him completely, taking different routes through the neighborhood to avoid walking past his house. David heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Helen was considering moving to a different community where she could find people who respected proper standards. 6 months later, David's house felt like home in a way it never had during those first difficult months. His neighbors were friendly and welcoming. The new HOA board was reasonable and fair, and his driveway remained blissfully free of unauthorized vehicles. David had learned some valuable lessons from the whole experience. He learned that bullies often rely on their victims being too polite or too afraid to fight back. He learned that documentation and legal knowledge were powerful weapons against harassment. Most importantly, he learned that standing up for yourself often inspires others to stand up for themselves too. The no parking signs were still posted at the entrance to his driveway, but they had become more of a symbol than a necessity. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the story of how David had stood up to Helen and won. The signs served as a reminder that even the most entitled bullies couldn't push people around if their victims refused to be pushed. David often thought about what would have happened if he had given up early in the conflict. If he had just accepted Helen's parking and tried to avoid confrontation, she would have continued to abuse her power and terrorize other residents. By refusing to back down, David had not only protected his own rights but had helped create a better community for everyone. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. But as David had learned, standing up to bullies doesn't just protect yourself, it protects everyone who comes after you. And sometimes that makes all the stress and conflict worth it. The silver sedan never appeared in his driveway again, and David never had to call the towing company again either. The neighborhood had learned that there were consequences for treating people badly, and David had learned that he was stronger than he had ever imagined. His first house had truly become his home, and no entitled neighbor was ever going to take that away from him again.